we sort of grouped the areas of recommendations into 9 key themes, which are up here, and we've got a slide on each one. So if we just maybe, in the interest of time, just go to the next slide and go through that. So these slides are not meant to be comprehensive, but in each one, but they either give examples or more detailed recommendations. So the first one is clearly the creation of enabling regulatory frameworks for cross-border payments. I think this is something we've talked about a lot over the last few days. We've had good examples. Ethiopia is a very good example on the exclusivity agreements, Nigeria as well. But how to balance the risk-based approach is a particularly important one. And also, not just for regulators, but we're saying for other market participants, there's a real role to play, particularly the private sector, in developing standards, minimum service levels, for instance, for compliance, which would really help both in building up consumer trust in the industry, but really could help them with managing the banks on this de-risking issue. And then we also said about identification. This comes under proportionality, is try and get consistency, but also if we're talking about a world where under FATF regulations it's a risk-based approach, let's not say that means we have to put barriers in place or disproportionate controls where the risk is very low, and that's particularly for low-value payments. So that's another area to look at. So area number 2 is around improving the domestic payments infrastructure. And as you see there, we said particularly in relation to new technologies. Really one of the things we're saying is, and I think to come out quite clearly, is that technology can play a really positive role in both enhancing access for people, but also reducing cost. But one of the other things that's seen, if you look at mobile as a good example, is that actually where there are successful mobile cross-border payments, that's only driven on the back of having good domestic payments environments that handle the same types of services. Because at the end of the day, as we've said, there's much more demand for domestic services than cross-border services. So you need to have that first. So you need to develop the local infrastructure, and it needs to be sort of a fully inclusive approach. So we're not just talking about payments here, we're talking about how do you link remittances in this case to all forms of domestic payment. That's really important, which brings us on to interoperability. And I think we've heard about the very good example of the scheme that Tanzania is doing, or has done, with interoperability within its own market, and then now looking to do it on a regional basis as well. Of course, when you look cross-border, there are issues that aren't just technology-driven, such as harmonisation of regulatory limits and so on, that really need to be there. And I think where every time we mention technology, we should look broader than just pieces of kit or think of software designers or tablets or phones. We need to think about the business model and the consumer and how is that going to work. So we should always not think technology, but think customer-focused solution. And then as part of all of that, with these, we need financial awareness and literacy. Now, so for those of you who could read the last slide, you probably can't read this one so easily, so apologies for that. But this is on the different area of data collection, and this is a pretty broad area covering quite a number of different elements. So, and it's really important that we have accurate information, because that's realistically the only way to persuade policymakers who don't necessarily understand about this space what actually, you need to make the case, whether it's policymakers at government level or in the private sector, that there's actually a business case for doing this. And I think quite often we spend a lot of time talking about data for government levels, but actually yesterday in our session, we spent quite some time talking about building up business cases for the private sector, and that's really important. So at a national level, we already heard some of the specific things from the different feedback sessions we've just heard, but I think one of the key things, certainly for macro level policy, is it would be great in the ACP region if there was a consistent approach as to what data was being collected and how it was available. And also, given that for formal remittances there is always an electronic or digital trail, there is no reason why the service providers for those products shouldn't provide that data to any regulatory body that's actually licensing them, for that to then be aggregated up and shared across government, but also with broader stakeholders, as long as it can't be attributed back to individual companies. There's commercial sensitivities, but that shouldn't get in the way of macro data gathering. So there's a whole series about high-level remittance flows. Then you've got diaspora data, which we heard a bit about, but that's absolutely vital. You can use certain tools like censuses, border data. We heard some good examples from Togo around collecting data at borders from people before they go and so on, and doing surveys. But there's a couple of considerations around data. One is actually how to handle the data privacy issues. And I know that often gets looked at long after the data's been collected, but actually that's a really important area that needs to be looked at, and there need to be appropriate policies and safeguards there. And then the other one is, now with social media and everything, we're not just talking about traditional means of data gathering, we've got lots of different tools. There's so much information, I think Barry used the term, there's so much information, nobody even knows what to do with it. But actually this big data, how can it be used to really help with understanding the environment, what consumers need, but also what solutions there are. And the final point we put, which I know is a bit of an obvious one, but the data needs to be accurate. And we know in the remittances environment, the first time anybody puts a number up, the question is, well, where did you get that one? And then the next comment is, well, actually, that's completely wrong. So we need to get more accurate data, or at least to be able to substantiate and bring the people we're trying to explain what the data means, to get them to accept that this is a pretty good indication, they should accept it, and then we get on with substantive discussions. Next one, please, thanks. So then, having got data, we then sort of turned that on its head, particularly on the consumer side, and said we need to improve transparency. And I think one of the things in ACP is there probably are a lot of opportunities to improve transparency at another level. We saw John demonstrated price comparison tools. We think they could have a really good impact as long as you can actually get consumers to be aware of them and use them. That's the sort of underlying thing there. We put consider regulation, but this is more about the private sector should be providing transparent information to every customer who is sending or receiving a remittance. And there are good examples in Europe and the US where that has been enshrined in legislation, and the customer has full transaction details before they make the transaction. Not even having to compare with another one, but they know what they're buying, basically. Generally, in ACP, there is no regulatory piece for that. And we heard earlier about the South Africa example of high prices. When we do the remittance price worldwide data gathering or Send Money Africa, we find it is very difficult to get any sort of information about the true cost. You tend to get a blended cost, and they don't tell you how much is going to be received. So there's some good examples of where these types of things are quite easy to implement, actually, and can make a difference. We need things, consumer protection, how to complain, those types of things as well, letting people know what their rights are. And then, of course, you've got transparency, some of these other levels, financial literacy, communication and awareness types of activities, even leafleting, working with community groups and so on. The final point we put there is actually, and it could probably come in the stakeholder section at the end, but also saying at national levels, establishing working groups of different stakeholders, so government, money transfer operators, consumer groups and so on, can really help to improve transparency about what's going on and also feedback on the different areas that could do with attention. So that's there. No, sorry. Keep going. So the next one was sort of the informal section, and we've split this into two. So one is actually just trying to understand how big it is. And again, we had a great example in our group yesterday. Barry was saying that the official number for remittances to Democratic Republic of Congo is 100 million, I believe. but he's telling us the informal, or the total including that, including the informal, is estimated at 9 billion. So if you're a policymaker in Kinshasa and somebody comes to you and says, we really need to improve the remittances environment, and he says, well, it's only 100 million, and you turn around and say, well, it's 9 billion, you're going to have quite a long conversation to even get on the same page. So being able to measure the informal, where it's accepted that it exists, is really important. And I think it's probably one of the most challenging areas we've come across, because the best practice that we've probably seen, and probably part of it is in the African region, is things around FinScope studies and so on. Really household surveys. I know Sahela and Don, you were involved very much in the early days when the World Bank promoted or undertook studies in Kenya, Uganda and Ethiopia on household surveys, and it demonstrated the remittance volumes were, I think, 5 to 10 times more than the official data, and the figures were accepted. So it's, by its nature, it's not going to be recorded anywhere, so it needs a lot of different surveys, really. And Togo also have developed some good tools to manage that. But we also think this is an area where standardising or sharing of best practice could add real value, because there is no simple answer. But understanding what has worked in what environments is really important. So this is a key area to look at. And then if we go to the next one, which is linked to that, is if we understand what the informal sector looks like, how can we actually then bring these informal transactions into the formal sector? And there are a number of different areas here, although we accept that this is probably one of the most difficult areas, and I know it's one that many of the government representatives here really want the answer to. If there was one thing they could answer, this would be it. So, there are certain things that the diplomatic missions and can do, whether it's actually out in the diaspora countries or whether it's when they're issuing new passports, providing information to members of the diaspora who are using the, let's say, informal methods, either because they're not aware of other methods or they have misconceptions, or they're doing it maybe because it's more convenient and you actually need to try and get a different message across. So there's one set of actions you can take there, which is around communication particularly. The other area is how we deal with this really thorny problem of undocumented migrants wanting to be able to send money back home, but actually not being able to because the legal environment of the country they're in doesn't allow undocumented migrants to send money. And we don't pretend there's easy answers here. We've heard about the matricular consular that was used in the US for the Mexican community, which took a lot of negotiation at government level. We really think that this is something maybe on a regional and government level, at a very high level dialogue, heads of state sort of level, is going to have to be addressed, because it's not something that an individual country, if it went to Saudi Arabia or South Africa and said, we'd like to introduce a scheme to bring our undocumented migrants to allow them to send money home, their first reaction is probably going to be, well, they shouldn't be here in the first place, so why are we going to relax our arrangements just for you? So this is going to take quite a lot of advocacy and developed argument, but it's something that we think is so important, certainly needs to be worked on. The next point is around incentives. I think we've had some quite interesting discussions around whether introducing incentives will help. Well, certainly they could help, but are they practical, certainly in terms of affordability and so on? And we've talked at some point about Pakistan Remittances Initiative. The Canadian government has is undertaking projects in this space in a different way. But I think it's something to be considered. And certainly if there are changes needed in consumer or stakeholder behaviour, or perhaps it's just to get the ball rolling, then maybe there are some incentives that are required. It doesn't mean they have to be there permanently, but certainly it's a tool that should be considered and used where appropriate. The diaspora investment piece, I mean, I think Jibril gave an excellent summary that I would struggle to, I'm not trying to compete with, but even to embellish, but just say there's probably, we could have 9 or 10 slides just on this particular area, But a number of these, we saw different countries, Cape Verde and Togo, have had different strategies and used different tools. And when we talk about diaspora investment, we don't just mean dollars or pounds or euros. We're also talking about expertise and sharing of knowledge and so on. And that requires a different approach, but actually, in many ways, is a good entry point for diaspora members to contribute without having to take a financial risk. I think the other point is, how do you build trust with diaspora that they can invest in their country of origin, and that the money is going to do what it's supposed to do. That's probably more important even than getting all the returns that they're promised, but there's a lot of trust that needs to be developed there. We'll go to the next slide. And then the final one we had for now was to sort of improve coordination among stakeholders. So stakeholders is quite a wide term, so stakeholders can mean, as we know, governments, private sector operators, international development agencies, the diaspora members, the receivers of remittances, and so on. So it's a lot of people to bring together. But so building levels of trust, understand where we are at the trust basis really will help. I think there's work to be done about raising awareness of the value of migrants' activities, which is always good, sharing best practice. Jibril mentioned entrench and retain. We don't know all the answers there, but it's something we need to work on. I think policy coherence is really important. There are quite a lot of players in this space, and I think the Action has done a really good job in bringing together a number of those in its own way. But I think making sure that we're maximising what already exists, and then using individual strengths of different policy groups and different resources to achieve the overall aim, rather than repeating what's going on, is really, really important. So that's a continual challenge, but we will get there. I think something around having, and you may have talked about this morning, so we weren't there, but establishing a database of best practices, a repository of information. I mean, I know that IFAD has, what is the site called, so the Remittances Gateway. So I don't know how many of you are signed up to the Remittances Gateway, but that is sort of an example of something that does exactly that, shares best practice and so on, having a forum for exchange of values. If you look at the exchanges that have gone on, certainly I've been really impressed by both the depth and the openness of everybody to share and work together. And I think, personally, I'll be taking away about 40 more contacts than I arrived with people that I can pick the brains of and just share ideas. And what's been really good to me is it's not judgmental, and there haven't been other agendas. So, I think if we can leverage that, and I'm sure that's what you were discussing between 9 and 11 when we were out sunning ourselves, is exactly there. So I think those are sort of the 9 themes that we came out with. I think as we reflect over the next few weeks, also in more detail on what's been discussed, then we may either elaborate on those, but certainly we'll go deeper, and we will aim to produce a report that is not a narrative, but it's a working document that people can use to prompt ideas, to help, and also practically say where you can get more information and so on.